Well, now we're actually starting to get somewhere. Just like in the last lesson, this one is fairly big. There's a lot of stuff to go through. We're actually going to be looking at all of the actual elements and the components that are built into Oxygen. I'm going to show you what they do and how they work, just so you get an idea and an understanding of what things you can do by default, where they live, and how you interact with them. Now this is the last one before we start playing with stuff together. So like I said, there's a lot to get through, but you can just sit back and listen to me explain through this stuff. So again, grab yourself a drink, sit back and relax, and let's get stuck into it. Here we are back in the Oxygen Builder, and what we're going to be looking at in this lesson is the actual components that we can use in Oxygen. And this is, so we're going to be looking largely at this left-hand section. Now you can sit back and relax. So I'm just going to talk through a lot of this stuff. Some of you may notice that what we're looking at here is the standard version of Oxygen. And there is a version that has what's called composite elements. At the end of this module, I will do a bit of a bonus on composite elements and just quickly running through what those new things do. But we're going to look at the core things in this video, and these are the sort of building blocks that you will use. Now let's run through these things. I'm going to go through them from top to bottom. I'll go through the basics quite quickly, and then I'll circle back and go into some of these in detail. So we've got these grouped into sections, so it's fairly easy to understand. We've got containers, so sections, divs, and columns, and I'll explain these in a minute. We've got text, headings, text, and rich text, and I'll show you how we use these in different situations. Links, visuals such as images, videos, and icons, and then we've got other, so we've got code block and inner content. Now the code block, we're not going to be using much custom code in this build at all. We'll be doing some bonus videos on code, custom code for those who want to get into that. But this isn't something we'll be doing too much of at all throughout the build. It is where you can do some, custom PHP and JavaScript, and that's essentially where it lives. So I'm pointing out the inner content here, purely because this is a part of the template system. Now, if you create an inner content, it allows you to create a catch-all and also inherit templates from a parent template if you want. And you need to use that if you're going to inherit another template. So what it does is actually grab the content from, say, Gutenberg or WordPress and display that body of text in the builder here in the page. And there is another way to do something similar under WordPress, but this inner content is specifically related to if you want to do that templating system where you relate to another template. So that's important, and we'll go over that in detail and show an example of that later on in the build. Moving on to helpers. So unlike the basics, which are really very much the simple core elements of HTML, these things are essentially pre-made little scripted components that have been made. Some good examples of that are something like the header builder, which allows for navigation and stuff to be set up relatively quickly. Social icons is a good example as well. If you go back to basics, we already have icons and you can add the icons individually, but using something like social icons, it gives you a list of the standard stuff like Facebook and Twitter, and you can just paste the links in, so it makes it a little bit quicker. All of these things are things that you could do anyway, and some of these things you might not use. For example, I'm not going to use this testimonials box or the icon box or a progress bar very often. Some of the really good things though, easy posts. Now this essentially is dynamic content that has some predefined, news layouts made. A gallery, fairly obvious. Now the repeater is very similar to the easy posts, except for it allows you to do something that's totally customized. And we're going to look at these things again in detail. But I just wanted to point out that these probably are pretty useful things. Some of these things here in interactive are fairly obvious, such as the slider, tabs, toggle, and a modal, and a super box that is really quite handy. It gives you two layers or two divs that you can put different content in, and you can show different ones on hover. So it gives you some really cool options with creating rollover effects. You've got Google Maps, which you can add a map in at any time, and then SoundCloud. So I don't put much SoundCloud stuff in there, but there's an option for it built in. Now let's have a look at WordPress. So this is essentially the stuff that's a core part of WordPress and isn't really a part of Oxygen. It's the stuff that's in WordPress already that you would generally put in themes if you're customizing a theme or working with a theme. So stuff like being able to put widgets in, or stuff like dynamic data, for example. Let's put in a title, and we'll have a look at this. So if I put in a title, and then I put in some content, you'll see this is being grabbed here from the actual dynamic data of this page. So we're looking at front page. If I had another page such as about, when I selected about on this list, this content would change. So the cool thing with that is if we look at all of this stuff here in WordPress, it's going to allow us to add some of that dynamic content. And this was the thing here that I was saying is similar to the inner content, where inner content would grab this actual part of dynamic data where you say content is you're free to use that anywhere, and if you use that, it's not connected to the templating system itself. It's just purely its own dynamic content, really. Some of the other things in this WordPress, we've got a pro menu and a normal menu. We're going to look at the difference between the two, not right now, but we will break down the difference between the two. We've got shortcode and a shortcode wrapper. If you need to copy and paste something like from a form to put the shortcode in a page, you'll use these. Now, a wrapper is essentially the same thing, but it has a wrapper around it like a div that you can put some extra styling on, for example. Now, some of these standard things around blogs, such as like comment lists and comment forms, login forms, search forms, these aren't forms like, a form builder. They are the standard things in WordPress that they have, like comments and a search, for example. So you can put these on the page. All right, let's have a quick look at library. Now, we talked about design sets already, and we haven't installed any design sets with this build, but you can have them turned on or off so you can still see them and add stuff from the design sets. So if you haven't added them or installed one, they can take a little while to load. It shouldn't be too bad. There we go. But none of this code is a part of our system until you sort of select one of these and drag it into the actual page. Now, I don't want to do that, but it does. It's a nice way to see what's actually available for you that's already pre-built. And we've got all of these things here that are broken down into, I guess, all the individual components of pre-made things. Now, that's all of the design sets that are available. And you'll notice the top one here is Oxy Agency, and that's the one that we are creating. That's because we've selected this as an option to create our own design set if we so want to. Now, the only reason you would use a design set is if you're going to reuse it yourself or maybe even on sale. But what it does is the same as what we just saw. It gives us the ability to look at pages, templates, and sections. The only thing is we haven't set any up yet. But once we start doing that, and we'll do that in the course, we're not going to do the whole thing. You can go through and do your own design sets if you want, but we'll show you how to start setting this stuff up. Because this brings me to the next point. Rather than using design sets, a lot of us will rather use just reusable parts. Now, we've already made that footer in a previous lesson. And what that does is it is where all our reusable parts are made. So if you created like a call to action, or you created a header, or you created a slider, all of these things you can save as reusable parts and then drag them and drop them or add them at any point to any template or any other reusable part actually. Now, when you go to click a reusable part, what you'll see is it gives you two options, and one is to add it as a single usable part and one is editable. When you click editable, what it does is it actually disconnects the reusable part from the library itself, and it treats it as its own copy, and you can customize it and do whatever you want with it. It doesn't affect the reusable part itself. But most of the time what you're going to do is add it as a single reusable part, and that means that it's a part of the library, and if you make a change, for example, if you had a grey footer and you change the background color on the footer, it's going to update every single place that's used that reusable part, which is where its power really is. I want to go back to the basics and actually explain some of these things. So let's actually get rid of some of this stuff and clean up the build that we've got. We'll go into history and undo some of these. Let's go look at some of these basics. What we've got here, we're going to look at these containers first. And we've got essentially a section and a div and a column. Now, how do these differ? Well, essentially sections and columns, they're the same as a div, except for they have some sort of smarts behind them. So let's add a section, for example. And you can see what we've been given here is a whole section. So I'll go to the structure and we've got section 1. And I'm going to give this some color. We're not going to look at styling right now, but I want to just help you sort of see what's going on here. So we've got one section. And if I add another section, you'll see that a section doesn't go inside another section there. It's essentially what it sounds like. It's a section. So you might have your header, you know, your intro, you might have a call to action, and then you might have your footer, for example. And there's like the flow of the content for your website. The difference with something like a div is that you can put a div inside a section. Now, looking at all of these as well, what's important here, and we're not going to go just into styling, but what's important is down here is we can actually change the way that the section is being output in the website. So at the moment its tag is a section, but you can change it to a div or a footer or a header. Now these are almost SEO type cues and accessibility type cues because it's giving the browser and the user an idea of what type of content that is. So for example, if this was going to be our footer, we could change that to footer. And if this was going to be our main content, for example, we could change this to article or main. And this could be an article, for example. Now you can leave this stuff as a section, but I'm just showing you that this is an option here. Again, header. And they don't display any differently. It's just actually the wrapper that wraps around this when the code is output. Now, when we do a div can go inside a section, and we'll give this color so you can actually see it. And a div can actually go inside a div as well. You can nest these, and you can see if I open up this panel on the right, we've got the section with the div inside it. And we could put another div inside that div. Now we're not doing styling yet. Again, I've said that, but I'm just pointing out how this stuff works. If we select the div, again, you'll notice that with the sections, the default tag was a section, and the div's default is div. And if we scroll down, we can do the same sort of things. We can set this as a header, as a footer, as a few other things. So if you get into this sort of stuff and you want to take this stuff further, you can really customize this and change this to be whatever you want. But a lot of the instances, just having it as a div is going to be totally fine. I'll go into this section here and we will add some columns. Now again, columns create a wrapper, and then inside of that, it gives us the options to sort of do stuff like a 2-column layout, a 3-column layout, a 4-column layout. And if we click this, say 50/50, you can see what it does. I'll go to this right-hand side. We've got a div and another div, and they're both set at 50% wide. Now with this here, I'm going to duplicate this. I'll go duplicate, and then I'm going to align them so they're next to each other for a second. I'll make one a different color just so we can see what's going on here. So we've got these two divs here. Again, I'll change the color of one. We've got these two divs here and one is set to 50. If I change this to say 55, the other one automatically changes to 45. Now some people like this because what it's actually doing is some of that thinking for them, and some people don't. They want to do that thinking for themselves. But you can achieve the same thing without using the columns. You could just use the divs, for example, and do the same thing where we go 55% and then put this one to say 45% and achieve exactly the same thing with exactly the same positioning and layout. But the columns just think for itself. So if I go back to this and change this one to 40, the other one goes to 60. Whereas if I change this one to 40, this one remains at 45. So you can see that shift in the difference between these two. So that's some of the advantages of columns and how they differ from, I guess, the divs itself and how sections work. All right, let's move on to text. We'll put some text in some of these and start to work through these. If we look at headings, for example, when we add a heading, what you'll find is something similar. We're given a set tag, and that is the H1. Now, if you know about headings and HTML, you should understand that headings, H1 is something we only want to display once. As a bit of a pet peeve for me with Oxygen, I wish that every time I added a heading, it would add it as a H2, purely because there's less urgency to change this. So when you add a heading, it's really important just to remember that you may want to change this from H1. You do see that the default styling changes, and that's to do with the global settings, which we'll be going over in detail. We'll have a whole lesson on global settings. But you can still change this. If I, for example, change this to 55 pixels and I change it to H2, it hasn't changed the size because we put a set size on it. It's really just changing what gets output in the code as far as what tag it is. And so you need to be careful and consider around what heading you are using there. And again, I'm going to delete this out here and just go to the default styles. All right, move on. I'll put the paragraph next to this and we'll go to text. And again, if we have a look at the text, it's the same thing as we've been seeing, which is fairly consistent. We've got a tag here, and I think the default should be a paragraph tag. That's just my personal preference, but it does display with a div as its wrapper. And you can change this again to specific things if you want. So to say that it's article text or a summary, or if you want to have your wrapper as a div. You can leave it by default. Any of this stuff will be fine as default. My preference is to add this as a paragraph, but you don't have to feel like you need to. Now lastly, I'll put this one in here, is we have a rich text block. Now the difference between these two, and remember I said before, if you double click this, we get some of these settings along here. With the rich text blocks, if we double click this, we're actually giving like a WYSIWYG editor. So something where we can combine headings and normal text with each other. So we can put a paragraph 2 in there, save and close. Now this is really good if you're making custom Gutenberg blocks, because it means that when the client wants to add content in there, they're not forced to having just a heading here and then text there. They can choose whatever type of text they want in there. So if we had a rich text blocks there and a rich text blocks in here, the client could actually choose if they want a heading in either or both. So it gives you more flexibility with the Gutenberg blocks. So that's a good place where I would use this rich text. Okay, let's have a quick look at some stuff like links. I'm going to add this underneath this rich text. We've got a standard text link, and that's pretty basic. That's just like text in a line of text, and we have the option to put some text in there and change the colors, etc. Now, a link wrapper actually is almost like a div itself, and you can put anything you want in there. So you could put, for example, an icon, you could put a heading, and put as much stuff that you wanted in there. So look, this looks pretty horrible, I know, but we could put our own stuff in here. So link block, it's a link wrapper, but you can see what we've got here is a few things. So going to the right here, you can see we've got a link wrapper, and you can put anything you want inside that link wrapper. And then you can actually put a link on the outside of all of those elements at once. So if you wanted to do something like, icons or news blocks where you want the whole area to be clickable as a link, this is how you would set that up. Now, lastly, I'll do this underneath this rich text. We add a button. And again, that's fairly self-explanatory. It's actually a button, which is different to a text link. So you've got the background and stuff, for example. And we can customize all of these things, but it's just showing you the difference between, I guess, all of these links and what they do. All right, let's keep things moving. Now, these visual elements here, such as image, video, and icon, they all work a similar way. So if I put an image in here, for example, what it does is it puts a bit of a placeholder in there for me, and then we can browse to find that image in our library if we've uploaded something. This is all I've uploaded so far. Select that, and that puts it in there. That image is not a great size, and we would set a different width or set the sort of base up differently. But you get an idea. This is how that is added in there. And the video and stuff works the same way, where it gives us a base, and then we can link to, say, YouTube, for example. All right, so that is a good overview of the actual components. Hopefully now you have a good idea of what the components are and where they live and some of the things that they do. That's a lot of stuff to go through. Now, I'm sure you've learned a lot, and I think you're doing great. But let's not waste any time. I know you're probably excited to actually start building some stuff. So mark this one complete, and I'll see you in the next lesson.